Okay, the motive behind my doing this is just that I talk. I can think better when I'm talking out loud, and it feels weird not talking to anybody, like, when I'm talking, so I'm at least putting this out there as a potential thing that could get viewers that people might be watching, so I can kind of justify it to myself that way. I'm right now trying to figure out, because I kind of went back to square one. Why do I smell weird? I think it's from the detergent. It because I realized that God, or actually, okay, to back up a little bit, reason why I'm calling this How to Defeat Ehyeh is because God doesn't, like, the way that Hebrew grammar works is there's a different form for what one is calling someone else and what one calls oneself. So God calls himself Yahweh, so far as I know. I mean, it's a really complicated thing, and it's something that I need to research further. Because, I mean, it's still not settled by people doing historical research. Most people call him Yahweh, and that's kind of the majority consensus, but that doesn't mean it's the only possible word going out there that's the translation of the sources in Hebrew. So, how to defeat him? I don't know. Because Ehyeh is different from Jesus or Yahushua. I'm not really sure how that's pronounced either, and I probably ought to research that too. I mean, I guess I could just refer to him as Christos, which is the Greek version, which would just be Christ. I don't know what the Hebrew version is. I mean, it's kind of a lower priority. I guess I could add that in there. But, the New American Standard version, that version says that, I mean, the point that they make there in the commentary is that Christos is not he's not the same thing as God, and he never said he was the same thing as God. But other people, like, other than him, like, well, I mean, that's the same thing, but others described him as God, but he really didn't say that himself, and the Bible doesn't really support that. He had a specific role, and he's described as a son of God, not the son of God. which means that, the same, I think that, I mean, the New Testament shows that Christos can be defeated, but not using the same methods that you would use to defeat God, because they aren't the same. And the Trinitarians also believe in the Spirit, but the same NASV says that it's just a Spirit, not the Spirit of righteousness or the Comforter, or the various ways that the Holy Spirit is described. Like, they're just saying, okay, that's something that's of essence, something that you should be doing. But this, so the Spirit really isn't an issue at all, because the Spirit isn't even, like, there isn't an entity of the Spirit. I mean, I've already got my reasons outlined why I want to defeat him, or why somebody should try to defeat him. But, as to the actual how to defeat him, I don't know. So the question is, what are his weaknesses? Does he have any? Alright, inability to change. Ehyeh is changeless. He remains in the same state, which means that, at least so far as he thinks, he can't be altered to the negative. Like, he can't be adversely affected by anything because that would be a change in his state. Which would mean that he... What would a change in his state mean? He's just asserting that he has no change in state. So I need to figure out whether or not he actually says that. Like, is God changeless? Is God changeless? Is God changeless? Right, well, this is someone else saying this of God. And again, this is James. This is not words coming directly from God. This better not be an actual video. I don't think I'm going to get anywhere with these links. God might seem to change, but I'm going to rhetoric my way into saying that he can't. Is Ezekiel the one who ascended heaven? Who has ascended to heaven without dying in the Old Testament? That was really accurate. Enoch and Elijah. Alright, now you're making an illicit minor, I think, here. Because you're saying, okay, one thing, or Ezekiel was subsumed to heaven. Ezekiel was just, therefore God subsumes all just men. Alright, so that's a fallacious statement there. Alright, so to extend that, he's doing a straw man argument by saying that other people are saying all those who are just are subsumed. Alright, so he's making an assumption here. All those who are just are subsumed. None of those who are non-Enoch and non-Elijah are those who are just. Therefore, no others are subsumed. So, that is a fallacious statement again, because the Bible makes a point of saying that there are many other people who were just and who were righteous in God's eyes, but they were not subsumed. Because that's what he's saying in that verse. He shall surely live, says the Lord God. Well, okay, the guy did not live. Ezekiel was mortal. He was not subsumed to heaven. That is one situation of a man who was just and does what is lawful and right. So, first of all, God didn't follow through on his promise that he would surely live. He died and went to heaven, which was the second life, and being reborn in heaven. Not born, just going to heaven and being restored to an eternal body. But he didn't really live in the traditional sense. When you look at the Qumran scrolls, they make a point of saying that those who are unclean and unrighteous and rebellious will die and are sent away, and will, in some cases, will die as the laws of Gentiles command, because they've left the Israeli nation and are working against God, and so therefore the Israelites were able, and by Israelites they meant the Qumran community, because they didn't consider like downtown Jerusalem as Israel, they just considered themselves as Israel. So what they were doing was they were saying, if anybody is outside of that, well, then we can execute them as if they were outside of the church state, of Israel. So they would make a contrast between those two things. If you're righteous, you live. If you're unrighteous, you die. So basically, when they're saying something like this, he shall surely live, what that meant was, if you're just going by the Qumran idea, which was based on the older Mosaic laws, it would mean that, well, we're just not going to kill you. In other words, you're okay. You got whitelisted. You're not, or it's not even that you're whitelisted. It's just you're not blacklisted as someone who's going to die. So it's like, wow, thanks. That's really generous of you to not kill me. It's like in Guardians of the Galaxy. It's like, normal people, they don't even think of eating others. That just isn't something that comes up. So going back to the subsumation thing, so God does treat just people differently. Ezekiel was not subsumed. Enoch and Elijah were. David was a man after God's own heart, which, if you look at all the evil things that David did, you get an idea of what God is like, It's like, okay, if David is sinful, then couldn't God be sinful? Or at least do things that for humans would be sinful, but for him are not. He respects it in every circumstance. Well, no, his response is not the same. He responded differently to Elijah and Enoch and Ezekiel as compared to Ezekiel. There were many other ways in which he responded positively to people's righteousness. With Job, Job was a just man, and yet, because of some scheming by, I don't know what he's actually called in the Old Testament, but I think he's like the accuser or the enemy in the Old Testament story of Job. But basically, Satan is, going, hey, look at these righteous guys. Want to start messing with him, see if he is tempted to change and curse God. But God treated him differently. He was just, and yet Job underwent great suffering. He lived, he eventually died, but that was as good as he had. The guy who was killed by David, he was just. Uriah, he was just, and guess what happened to him? He did not live. As far as God was concerned, God wanted him to live. So the earthly response is different. The heavenly response is going to be the same in that God gives a second life to those who are dead on earth. He gives them life in heaven, but he doesn't give them life on earth. So again, that's kind of some really tricky finagling of words to get it to the point of what it is that you want it to say. Which is that God is changeless. So, is that actually the case, that surely living just pertains to heaven? Or actually, this is in regards to Old Testament people who have died, which for them, for the ones who are righteous, when they die, they were, at least until the final judgment and the creation of a new heaven and a new earth, wherein all the people who have gone to various versions of heaven in his kingdom will be united in the same places. But back in the Old Testament, they were taken to, quote unquote, Abraham's bosom, which, if you can imagine a place where everything is like some hairy old Jewish guy's moobs, that does not seem like exactly something that's surely living, quote unquote. Of course, Ezekiel was an old hairy Jewish guy, but still, can you see why I might have a problem with that? But let's just assume, for the case of argument, that surely living is, a life after death of some variety, as opposed to being annihilated, which is what happens to those who are outside of Israel and outside of God's justice. I never use Feedly. I don't know why I've even got this here. Because usually I'll just copy paste the URL into Tumblr or anything that I'm using. I don't know why I even need this. Maybe I don't. Also, the fact that the bottom triangle in this is cut off is really bugging me. Alright, so just in regards to treating people justly and unjust, yeah, people after death are given life. And that's really assuming a lot. Like, it's kind of a foregone conclusion that God is fulfilling on his promises after death, because at least so far as our generation is concerned, none of us have seen heaven. And people that end up claiming to have seen heaven is really not true. It's not. When people are experiencing near-death experiences, they have a flood of endorphins in their brain, and it's detectable on MRIs, and that's what gives rise to these near-death experiences. So none of them are to believe. They are all personal revelation, which we're warned against in the New Testament, so we can't really depend on those. And all of the records in the Old Testament are also personal revelation, which again is a Gnostic thing, and you're just depending on that person's words that I spoke to God, I saw heaven, he's called me just, and then confirmed by others that hey, we think he's just too, he must have really been saying what he was seeing. But, the whole point of me doing this is that I do believe that, or at least supposedly believe that, for the purpose of argument. Because, at least part of my plan is, in canon, is to defeat God in canon. Alright, so for the moment, I've got to agree with that yes, there is a second life, and that God will surely live. So I'm trying to defeat God in canon. Defeating him outside of canon is pretty easy. You just say, have you seen God? No. Well, then maybe he doesn't exist. So, yeah, I'd have to agree with him that he's got a point. Because there really aren't any instances in the Old Testament that I can think of where someone who was just died and was not given life after death by God. Like, there aren't really any instances of unjust people making it into heaven, or just people not making it into heaven. So, yeah, I guess I'd have to agree with him on that. Okay, again, this is implying if you don't feed the hungry and clothe the needy, then you're oppressing the poor. No, that's socialism, okay? Implying that charging excess interest is unjust. Alright. So, just in that one respect, see, now I gotta break this down. Actually, Ezekiel was not subsumed to heaven. Alright, so that's still a fallacy. Ezekiel was given life after death. Ezekiel was one who was just. Therefore, God gives life after death to all of those who are just. Well, alright, so I'm trying to figure out if this is illicit minor or illicit major, but it's still a fallacy. Alright, which one is the subject? I think this is the major, and this is the minor, I think. So I think it's illicit minor. I could be wrong. I'm not quite sure. No, one instance does not mean that God gives that to all of those who are just. I mean, alright, look, you're saying a man versus, or I mean, you know, a man or a just man versus just men or men. And by that, I'm talking mankind. When you're in the context of the Bible, you know, them being not exactly the most feminist society that's ever been on the earth, they refer to mankind as man on the whole, or they refer to humanity as man. So anything that applies to man is probably going to apply to women as well, unless it's like some specific thing that says, you know, this applies to women, this applies to men. It's going to be pretty consistent over all of humanity. Maybe I should look up the original verse. Bible Gateway. Can't tell if it's loading. Oh, it says over at the bottom there. Alright. Yay, I remembered which one I like. But if a man is justice and practices justice and righteousness, and does not eat at the mountain, or lift up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel, or defile his neighbor's wife, or approaching a woman during her menstrual period. Oh, by the way, all this stuff is like in the halakhic texts, or halakhic text, actually I think is what it is, in the Qumran scrolls. If a man does not oppress anyone, but restores to the debtor his pledge, does not commit robbery, but gives his... wait, what are the italics? What's with the italics? Oh, that means alternate thing. Wait, verse 7. Why don't they have a note on that? Put it in italics. That means that they inserted that word there. Probably. Gives his bread to the hungry and covers the naked with clothing. If he does not lend, and then again they're inserting that in there. If he does not lend on interest or take increase, which means that they probably inserted or take increase. Maybe this was a single word. Interest or take increase. if he keeps his hand from my iniquity and executes true justice from man and man, if he walks in my statutes and my ordinances so as to deal faithfully, he is righteous and will surely live. What on earth does that even mean? Alright, it's not really relevant to this. Wait, so he was talking about earthly stuff? Commits abomination. By the way, what abomination are you talking about? Alright, so there's more than one thing that's an abomination. Because he says all of these abominations. Alright, so if this quote-unquote preacher had looked at the actual translation of the thing, or the closer version of it, then he wouldn't be applying this specifically to Ezekiel. Alright, so he's in the chapter just alluded to. Came to me. Wait, alright, so in the context of this, he's saying don't use this proverb. But we know that all scripture is God-breathed, and this is a scripture. So what problem did you have this anymore? I mean, what problem did you have with this now that you didn't have earlier? Alright, so it sounds like you're changing the rules, you're just not changing yourself, right? So you're talking about earthly consequences, though. Whoa. All the blood rushed to my head when I changed the way I was sitting. So you're talking about earthly consequences as are supposed to be handed down to earthly people by other earthly people. So we're talking about a justice situation of the way that things are supposed to be just. We're not really even talking about God here. We're talking about his subjects, his people. Yeah, I bet. I have no pleasure in the death of anyone who dies. Well, I thought God delighted in justice. Yeah, I find that really hard to believe. there are plenty of people who think that people of the Old Testament. Okay, there are many cases where the people of Israel would celebrate after defeating an enemy. God didn't really have any problem with that. He seemed to be delighting in it as well as they did and didn't rebuke them. So, I mean, does this apply to all men though? Yeah, but what does it have to do with Ehyeh? I mean, he's not really doing anything in that situation aside from commanding people. So, yeah, I mean, you could say that he's doing something indirectly, but he's still doing it. And following his commands is pretty much the same as him doing it. So is that a changeless command? Has his punishment ever changed for unrighteousness in regards to how we are supposed to deal with people? Yeah, it's varied. Cain was dealt with differently than other murderers. There are various different ways that people were put to death over the course of the Old Testament. Some were annihilated by fire, and not directly by the people of Israel. Some were drowned in a flood, and not by the people of Israel. But he said that his judgment would remain the same, that other than, things that are, people that are unjust would always die in some way. And those who are just would live. And there are no cases in which just people survived and unjust people, there are no cases in which just people died and which unjust people lived. Cain lived and was not put to death by unnatural means. So was Adam, Eve, Seth. And they had all committed injustice. Well, actually, Seth really hasn't had any documented stuff. It's just like, hey everybody, it's Cain and Abel, let's talk about them. What about Seth? What about him? He doesn't do anything. It's like, his story is boring. It's like, he's famous for just living. Noah and his family lived. All the unjust people died back then during the flood. How did David eventually die? How did King David die? natural causes.
The cause of death of David was natural.
Okay, so David was unjust, but he repented, which it goes on later in this that a righteous man will live. You betcha your way is not right. No, actually, my way is right and your way is wrong. So Cain didn't repent. He never repented. I don't ever remember him having an apology. I mean, Adam and Eve were feeling bad because they got exiled. But they didn't really repent and follow God. I don't know. I'm trying to think of any examples here. There are examples in the Old Testament when you're looking through the Beatitudes where all it'll say about a king is this king did not, or this king committed evil in the eyes of the Lord. That's all it'll say. Like this king committed evil in the eyes of the Lord. This king was good in the eyes of the Lord, or lived by the statutes of God, and that's all it'll say. It'll just have those one little lines. So without going into further detail on those, we don't know whether or not they died of natural causes or whether they repented. All we know is that they did something that was bad. And guess what? The Bible leaves out the part about them continuing to live and not being killed for their injustice. So they managed to survive, and God didn't put them to death. Otherwise, maybe I would have mentioned it. So we can't really look at those cases because they're pretty weak. So we got to look at the cases that are more detailed. Pretty sure King Solomon didn't exactly meet a good end. I think he repented, though. King Saul, he met a bad end. He was unjust. Samson, he met an early unnatural death because of his sin of not obeying God. How did Joshua of Israel die? He lived. So in the times of the judges, there was a big fat civil war. And so the unjust people warred against the just people, and of course the just people won, because Israel would never record something that was a loss, right? Or that the just people were not the ones who were defeated. So no matter what ends up happening, it's always the just people who make it out alive. In the big 400-year gap in between Malachi and Matthew, you had a lot of just people dying in that situation. In the Babylonian exile, that happened to Israel because they had sinned and they had um, left God's righteousness. They had not lived by his precepts. And so that's why they went into exile. In the slavery in Egypt, there were a lot of just people who died. Actually, I mean, I don't know if there's really any documented evidence of in the Old Testament about any Israeli dying from like being killed by the Egyptians. I mean, yes, they were in slavery and suffered as greatly as one could, but they didn't. They weren't killed. I mean, when Jesus came to earth, he changed it from those who are just will die and be taken to heaven, but they can still be murdered. Like the Holocaust and various martyrs, Christian martyrs who have gone, who have come and gone, been killed by the unjust people. But they're given second life in heaven. Oops. Forgot to put the lid back on it. Rats. So I can't really think of any examples of a time where someone has died an unnatural death in the Old Testament due to and still being just, and I can't think of any situations where an unjust person lived and didn't die an unnatural death. So yeah, I mean, my general impression is that that's the case, but I think I'm going to keep a lookout for those verses. I mean, if anything, it just indicates a general trend that Israel was trying to keep their PR intact by saying we don't kill just people and we don't suffer unjust people to live. Therefore our God is good. So you're also assuming that God is defining what is just, and what God does is just. If you look at North Korea, they call what they do just. So you've got this self-defining thing of I am God, therefore I am just. And I'm just because I say so. And I know this because I'm omniscient. And I'm omniscient because I say so, which it ends up being a loop. But a good question to ask is, how do we know that? Because we aren't omniscient, so how do we know that you are? Well, because I'm saying so. How do we know that you aren't the same way? Because I said so. So it's kind of a thing of, how do we know you're not lying? Well, I mean, I guess I could do a miracle or something. We'll do it. And then it's reported in the Old Testament as that he had done it. hit. Because, I mean, if you've got your entire culture hinging on God following through on his promises that he's going to create a miracle, you're not going to report that it didn't happen. I think it's Latter-day Saints, maybe it's Christian Scientists, maybe it's Jehovah's Witnesses. I think it's Jehovah's Witnesses. They had some woman who was declaring herself Jesus, and, you know, they said, fine, walk on water. And she goes, do you believe that I can walk on water? And they go, yes. Well, then your faith means that I don't have to. So she didn't end up following through on the miracle, which, you know, to everybody else should say, she's not Jesus. So if you report that, yes, a miracle did happen, then of course you've got to believe them. But you've also got to realize that a lot of times they're reporting miracles in order to keep their PR intact. In order to keep their basis for continuing to operate intact. So in other words, lying or exaggerating, saying that, oh yeah, Lot's wife, yeah, God turned her into a pillar of fire and we didn't kill her because she was wanting to return to Sodom and Gomorrah. And Sodom and Gomorrah, you know, none of us actually saw them being destroyed by fire. And it wasn't us that set them on fire, but that was God. We didn't actually burn those cities down. That was God. Or, you know, those cities might have remained standing, and we totally didn't come back and burn them down after we'd left and gotten more reinforcements. And we know for sure that they were burned down because God says so. And we didn't actually see it, but we know it happened because God wouldn't lie to us. We just believe it. So yeah, I mean, so far as I know, there aren't any cases where unjust people lived and just people died. In every situation, justice was done. In every single situation, that's what happened. That's what he's saying here, at least. Is that a stuck pixel or a piece of dust? I'm afraid to touch my screen because I don't want to get fingerprints on it. That's just a piece of dust. So yeah, but you know, he's saying here that God doesn't change based on his attitude, his one attitude towards righteousness and unrighteousness. Just in this action of killing people that are unjust and letting just people live. Like, that never ever changes. Therefore, he must not change in anything else. Just in that one respect, I would have to agree to him with that, unless I can find some example of an unjust person dying in a natural death and an unjust person wait. Okay, so the Bible only takes place in Canaan. At least in the Old Testament, it's kind of the region around Canaan and Egypt and the quote-unquote Middle East. Um, which, do people not realize that the globe is round? Like spherical, as in it doesn't have a beginning or an end to it. It doesn't have any edges or corners. So east of what? If you go far enough west, you get to where you would call east. Why are you calling it east? It's not really east of anything. It's east of everything. It's west of everything. Might as well call it the center. Or you could call it the Middle West or the Far West or the kind of not really West. Just not the Wild West. It's a misnomer. So, what about China? Africa? The Americas? South America? North America? Those are the Americas, plus Middle America. How about Australia? The Aboriginals? What about Russia? What about Europe? Are you trying to say that no people during that time lived who were unjust or died who were just? I mean, is that what you're saying? Because I'm pretty sure that wherever there were, that people back then were living by a little bit different rules than what the Israelites were doing. And prior to the Israelites coming to Jericho and destroying it because the city was unjust, what you had was, God is destroying Jericho because it is an unjust city, right? Because they're not, following what the Israelites are doing. So, yeah, in that city you had just people dying and unjust people living. So God's response to those people, for hundreds of years prior to the arrival of the Israelites, was to let them live. So, the Bible is, that seems like a contradiction to me. Eventually he got around to killing those people, but you had generation after generation that was committing injustice and who were killing just people and allowing unjust people to live. And they were obeying false idols and not living by the commands of the Israelites. So yeah, you had a situation where God was not responding equally to all people in the same way. So in this, God does change. And he's not consistent, at least. As far as Israel is concerned, he's going to respond the same within that community and within the people that the Israelites could see. But the Israelites came upon a city that had been unjust for a long time. So those people were doing that for a really long time. So God does change. In fact, not only does he not change, but he's inconsistent with it. It's not that he's changing his mind at one point. He never was consistent. And he never did have a consistent response. So explain that to me. Tell me how it is that you've got these unjust cities being destroyed because they're unjust and have been for hundreds of years. Because if God's will was being done, you wouldn't need to destroy the city. You would once the Israelites got there, because you'd either be destroying it when the Israelites got there or be destroying it without the Israelites. But if God's will is being carried out no matter what, with or without the Israelites, in this context, he's saying, you guys do it. In the context of Sodom and Gomorrah, God's saying, I'll do it. In the flood, God's saying, I'll do it. In the context of Jericho, for hundreds of years before then, what's he saying? I'm just going to wait until the Israelites get there. For 400 years, the Israelites had injustice committed against them, or at least getting towards the end of the 400 years. Initially they were like, Israel. I like being an Israelite in Egypt. It's sweet living. Joseph made it so. Uh, you had the Egyptians committing injustice and living. And then you had justice carried out against them eventually after the 400 years. But during that time, it's just part of my plan. They're committing injustice. They won't have the second life after death, but, as far as they're concerned, as they're living, they're not going to be put to death. They're going to, for 4 generations or so, they will continue to live, and then I'll take care of them. Let's say it just happened in the last half. Like for 200 years, they were in Egypt, suffering. Okay, so you got at least 1 generation in there that is committing injustice and enslaving the Israelites. And then you've got a generation after that where justice is being dealt to the Egyptians. And by the way, he's talking here about the righteousness and unrighteousness of the son and his father. Why should the son not bear the punishment for the father's iniquity? When the son has practiced justice and righteousness and has observed all my statutes and done them, he shall surely live. The person who sins will die. The son will not bear punishment for the father's iniquity, nor the father bear punishment for the son's iniquity. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself. If I read that several times, I could do it without stuttering and correcting myself, but I didn't. The firstborn of the Egyptians being killed, the firstborn males being killed. So were they wicked? Were they really wicked? We're talking like 2-year-olds. Were they wicked too? How about in Jericho? Were those sons bearing punishment for the father's iniquity, or did they just not have babies for like 20 years prior to the Israelites showing up? Because they died. They bore the punishment of their father's iniquity. So you're trying to tell me God is consistent in his justice, doesn't change ever. His response is always the same. Well, his response isn't the same. Because you've got just people dying, or people who are supposedly sinless dying, at least if you're following Catholic precept of babies don't have sin until they actually commit a real sin, like lying or saying no to their parents. And up until that point, yeah, you're perfectly free from sin. Well, that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says that if you're a newborn, if you're not like, if you're like a 2-celled egg in your mother's womb, you've already committed sin. In fact, if you're just a 1-celled thing where the sperm's already penetrated the ovum and that egg is already in place, well, that thing, if you just froze it like it was and then put it to death, destroyed it, yeah, that thing was sinful because it had inherited its parents' iniquity through the blood. Why should the son bear the punishment for the father's iniquity? Well, guess what? Adam and Eve committed an iniquity. That was passed down to us. And you're saying that they didn't? You should not bear punishment? Well, that's a contradiction. You're saying that we shouldn't bear it, and yet you're giving us the bearing of that punishment. We're being punished for their sins. But you're saying that we did it based on what we potentially would have done in that situation? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God? So you're saying that our iniquity is our iniquity and their iniquity is their iniquity, but you're saying that we've sinned and they've sinned, but our 2 sins are separate. Okay, that makes sense. The trees are turning really orange. All right, so that's a little bit different. Because if that's the case, you had the Israelites as adults. They have still committed the original sin by just, because they potentially would have. By the way, we're being punished for something that potentially we would do, not something that we've actually done, like potential crime. Like, we're going to execute you. Why? Because you committed a murder. Well, you didn't actually commit a murder, but you would have if we hadn't executed you. What? 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 Okay, can you just be executed now? Yeah, we're gonna execute you. Okay, I mean that makes sense and stuff. Wow. Yeah, I mean, because God's omniscient, so He knows what would be happening in every alternate reality. So basically, He's punishing us for what our alternate reality selves would have done. Yeah, that seems fair. He just knows our hearts, so He knows that's what we would have done. So yeah, that kind of makes sense. So what's the difference between an adult Israeli who who is who is obeying God's precepts and a Jericho inhabitant who's an infant and just has that one sin going for him? Well, that infant isn't living by God's precepts. He doesn't even. He's ignorance is no excuse apparently for um, committing a sin. So if that baby doesn't know about the precepts of Israel, then hey, it's fine. We'll go ahead and kill him. Um, because it's by the actions that baby is being judged, and God knows that, well, if that baby had lived to adulthood, it would have committed those things. So that baby is unjust for the sins that it would have committed, like future crimes. So we're actually going to kill these babies for their future crimes. So yeah, I guess you could say all those babies in Jericho, Sodom and Gomorrah, Hebron, everything that was in the warpath of Joshua. Um, yeah, all those innocent people, quote unquote innocent people. Well, it turns out they were all guilty of future crimes, so they all deserve to die by the hands of the Israelites administering God's justice. But that still does not answer the question of what was happening in Jericho prior to the arrival of the Israelites administering God's perfect justice. Because you had generation after generation committing injustice, and then finally you had the Israelites bringing it to bear upon the inhabitants of Jericho. So in that, you could say that that God was inconsistent in his judgment with those peoples. Plan or no plan, those people lived, whereas the just people died in those places. They were punished eventually, but they lived. So God's justice was not consistent there. So yeah, he did change in that. He varied, all right? In one point in time, God was administering one kind of justice to some people and another kind of justice to others. For the Israelites, he administered a certain kind of justice, but for Jericho, pre-Israelite destruction, he dealt a different kind of justice. So you're saying that God is static, but even in the moment, God is dynamic. In this one arena, God is dynamic. In these places. And that's not even counting the arrival of the Romans, who lived and were not killed for their injustice at the time of the occupation of Jerusalem. Rome burned eventually, empires fall, but for many, many generations they lived. So yes, in this one element, God is variant. Alright, so having defeated that point, that God is static in this one element of administering justice to the righteous and unrighteous, because he does vary, and varied in his treatment of nations prior to the arrival of the Israelites. Let's move on to the next thing, which is probably equally fallacious. God hates sin. Alright, does anybody know what sin is? Sin is that which is non-God. Or, other than living by the rules of God. In other words, God hates anything that isn't him. And I think I put this in my spreadsheet. Alright, so basically he hates anything that isn't him or isn't of him. God is always against that which is not him and unrighteousness in every instance. In this, God never changes. So he doesn't like stuff that isn't him, and that's pretty consistent. I mean, there's no case where he is for something that isn't of him. Anytime somebody commits something that isn't of him, God expresses disapproval of it. So, I'd have to say that that's actually the case, and I don't think I want to spend a lot of time thinking over that, because I'm pretty sure that, there's really no time where God says, hey, you committed something that's ordinarily a sin, I approve of that. And actually, that kind of helps my point along, that he's just a total jerk. By saying that anything that isn't of him, he's going to hate. So, yeah, I guess I'll just leave that like it is. God's attitude towards unrighteousness to righteousness is always the same. Yeah, right. I think that's not actually true, because there are many situations in the Old Testament where people wouldn't turn from sin, and then finally they would turn from sin, but it was too late. It was just because they were trying to get away from the punishments and didn't really want to turn from their sin. Like, I think there were people who were pounding on the doors of the ark in order to be let in, but it was too late. Maybe I'm wrong about that. That's probably some apocryphal thing. I can't think of any examples of someone who repented but was killed anyway. I mean, there's plenty of examples in the New Testament and post-New Testament in the early church and, right up until modern day where, good people die, bad people live. But, as far as the Old Testament goes, I can't really think of any examples of really there being that many repentant people at all. When Melchizedek revealed Ehyeh to Moses, I think it was Moses, no wait, Abraham. In that case, Abraham goes, okay, yeah, sure, I'll convert, and ends up cutting off part of the flesh of him and all the people in his house, or all the men at least, males at least. Not all the males, because, doing that with, like, an animal would be weird. Rahab, she repented, went over to the Israelite side. Yeah, I can't really think of any examples. God's pretty okay with people that repent. But, I can't really think of any situations where somebody repented and was killed anyway. Why does this keep getting thinner? Yeah, well, David didn't commit iniquity initially. Then he did commit iniquity, and then you're repentant from it. So you've kind of got a little bit of a contradiction here between committing iniquity and being able to repent from iniquity. Because right here you're saying, well, he's gonna die. So you gotta assume that there's going to be a gap wherein, boy, I better repent fast before I get killed for it, and turn from my iniquity. But if you get killed before then, well, yeah, the entire time he was iniquity. He was unjust. I mean, I guess, like, prior to their execution, the person gets asked, hey, are you going to change? No, I'm going to keep being unrighteous. Okay, we're going to kill you now. All right. Or going, hey, unrighteous person, you going to turn from your iniquity and turn to righteousness? Yeah, okay, I guess. Yeah, I'll do that. Like, all right, we're not going to kill you now. You'll yet live. Hey, unrighteous person, gonna turn from your iniquity? No? Alright, we're gonna kill you. Okay. We're killing you, we're killing you, we're killing you. I changed my mind. I want to be righteous. Oh, whoops, he's already dead. Well, this is a little bit of a hiccup. Nobody report this to the guy who's in charge of writing the Bible, okay? Wow. Okay, so these four options and the biblical presentation of each from Ezekiel 18 demonstrate conclusively that God does not change. Wow. So you're making the same illicit minor argument that you did earlier. You're saying that because God doesn't change with justice, therefore God doesn't change at all in anything. Alright, so here's where the fallacy comes in. God does not change in justice. The only things that God ever does are in regards to justice. Therefore, God does not change in anything he ever does. You see where the fallacy is? It's in this premise. The only things that God ever does are in regards to justice. Or first of all, in one of these things, we've showed that he does vary. I've showed, this guy doesn't. So he does vary in that. Alright, so now that we know that he varies in that, your first point that God does not change in justice, that premise is false also. And then the second premise, the only things that God ever does are in regards to justice. That's not true. Some things he does doesn't have anything to do with justice. It's just kind of... It doesn't really have to do with righteousness and unrighteousness. And some of the stuff he does doesn't have to do with justice. He creates stuff. He didn't create it because it was part of justice or righteousness. He created it because he wanted to have a bunch of self-affirming glory. So it kind of has to do with righteousness, but it really kind of doesn't. Therefore, I will judge you, O house of Israel. That doesn't directly pertain to people who are not of the house of Israel. In other words, Jericho. Each according to his conduct, declares the Lord God. So no, he is not saying each according to his ways. He's talking about conduct. In other words, actual actions. So basically, the infant in Jericho, in addition to being judged for his future crimes, was being judged in accordance to his conduct. So the baby's conduct, there's nothing unjust about it, so you shouldn't really be killing it, but it's because of his future crimes, which are not his conduct. In fact, they're his potential conduct. But God knows everything, so that's potentially the way he's going to be judged. And what about the pre-Israel generations in Jericho? Well, they were judged according to their conduct, which was unjust, and were still given life, and were permitted to live, and were not killed, and died natural deaths. So no, your point here is incorrect. God doesn't judge people according to their conduct that are not of the house of Israel. It was just in Israel that people were judged in accordance to their conduct. I keep overpronouncing my T's, putting too much emphasis on them. It's just because I happen to be getting to the end of my point and not really having any words after that to say. No, it's not that we're deciding, because we don't actually have a choice, and the Bible doesn't promote anything relating to free will. We don't have free will. God chooses things, it's just whether or not people turn. It's just, we're going to see how things pan out. If they turn, we'll do this. If they don't turn, we'll do this. But I know what they're going to do. We're just going to have to see. You guys are going to have to see what I'm going to do about it. By the way, this is from the Bible.net, Archangel's God by Jody. Well. Guess that's what I get for browsing random articles. Probably a Catholic, some kind of Episcopalian. Because the Bible does not say anywhere that women are supposed to be preachers. You're supposed to teach the younger women, but outside of that, you're just supposed to shut up and be silent in the church. Not have anything to say about anything. It's really not exactly the most pro-women culture. How long have I been recording? An hour and 45 minutes. So he's self-existent, he has supernatural existence outside of normal creation and physics. So what can he do? This is a mistranslation. Yahweh means I am that I am. It doesn't mean Lord. That's coming from the Middle Ages where people had lords and so they assume that God's got to be the same. That's applying a human title to a divine being. Calling God Lord is a mistake. By the way, also calling God God is a mistake. We are to call him Ehyeh, and God calls himself Yahweh. But we are not to call him Yahweh, and he doesn't call himself Ehyeh. And he sure doesn't call himself Lord, and we're not to call him Lord, and we're not supposed to call him God, because God is a Norse term, which just means, a god, a type of god. and it's related to Odin. So calling God God is really a mistake. I just do it because most people refer to him like that. In whom there is no variation. Yeah, except for the pre-Israelite Jericho people. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Well, Ezekiel might have something to say about that. Why should the son not bear the punishment for the father's iniquity? Well, because you said it in Exodus. Alright, so in the original thing, this must have said, I am that I am that I am, Adonai. Or actually, the I am that I am, the I am that I am, Adonai. Where's the language? Was that 13 or 19? I think it was 19. So who wrote this? James Scott Adams. So no, you're wrong. That guy's wrong. Or Jody is wrong. Sheesh. Do I really just have 2 tabs open now? Okay. So changelessness in regards to his justice is not the case. He varies and does change. We have a greater ability to change than God does. So he follows through on promises, which means that if he says he can't do something or that he won't do something, he's not going to do it. So that can be used against him because he won't destroy someone once they're already in heaven due to the promise of eternal life he made. So yeah, you can use that against him. At least he's although he finds ways to work around the promises that he's made, like he'll finagle things and kind of use these Bill Clinton-esque type of word juggling in order to make it seem like his promise is something different or the implications of that promise are something different. He's like a malicious genie. Well, you wanted this, so I gave it to you. It's like, no, you moron, you weren't listening to the spirit of what I was saying or listening to specific words. So, like, say you try to destroy Ehyeh in heaven. If you tried to do that, he might, like, imprison you or, like, just put you, like, in Futurama, like you're a head in a jar. He might find some way around it. Or you're living but you're forever unconscious. So there's ways around these promises that he can do. But he won't destroy someone completely. Actually, I should change this to annihilate for consistency. That doesn't really apply to people who are in the pre-heaven judgment. It might be like they have in some courts where it's like you've got a wall, so you can't possibly approach the judge. Like he might be judging from heaven, but as far as a judge, He can judge from heaven, but you can't get to the judge. So he might be on the other side of the gate, and nobody from the outside can get into the inside in order to do something about it. Like, he doesn't have some lawn chair parked outside of the gates of heaven to judge people with. He's doing all the judging from the inside, where he's hiding from the people who can't get to him. Or, I'm sorry, keeping himself pure from those who can't get to him. He's keeping himself pure from the impure, keeping them on the outside. But he's totally not afraid of them or anything. Actually, God despises things that are impure. He's a germaphobe. So what does that mean? He doesn't like things that are not of him, which means that anybody who goes into heaven has to be completely brain wiped and memory wiped and installed with brainwashing software, and has to be imprinted with a clone of God's will, and acting out of God's will, so that we're all walking around in heaven as zombies of him. Which really presents a challenge, because it's like, if anything of yourself remains, how are you supposed to do anything counter to God? Well, I mean, if God says that you will make it into heaven, he's referring to you as an individual, right? So you've got to keep something of yourself that remains. And probably one of my most defining traits is that I am against authority. Like, well, okay, that's not actually true. I used to be very, pro-authority, I guess, because I was wanting to use the power and the force and the position of being righteous versus unrighteous. I wanted to use it against people. And I think it's more that I just wanted to use power of some sort to get my way. And I'm still that way, and I still want to get my way, but I'm kind of targeting rival authorities. And I'm different now because I'm only wanting to go against people who are, primarily, I guess secondarily, maybe I'm wanting to go against people who are not exacting my will, but I'm more forgiving of people who aren't doing what I want. And I'm just like, hey, whatever, man. But if you try to coerce me, then I'm going to be against that authority, to the point where I'm almost solely against those people, and not really taking it down as far as, well, you're a Taoist. I don't like you for that. And I want to destroy you. I'm just like, anyone who's acting as an authority against me, I want to destroy. So God's the number one authority, so he's the one who I'm targeting, and if I can take him down, I can take anybody down. So my nature of being counter to authority is what defines me. So I'm going to retain that whether or not I'm brought into heaven. And since I am going to heaven, haha, you think I'm not? Well, I've already met the requirement of getting baptized. And, I can't really get unbaptized. So I'm in heaven whether you like it or not. I just won't be given as many gifts. So that's how I get my in, by making that promise once, it's effective eternally whether or not you turn your back on it or not, supposedly. So that's my in, and that's how an impure person can get into heaven, because technically they're covered by grace. You're not supposed to sin, but it just means less gifts if you do, I think, maybe. If not, I guess I'd still be in trouble, and in that situation, where if I'm not making it into heaven, I at least make it into the area where people are judged in the final judgment. In which case, it would be a matter of breaking into heaven. Getting past the gates, which would just be defeating his protectors, breaking open the gates, getting your way through there. Gates really aren't that powerful. And you can use the weapons of his protectors in order to bash them open. But then there's the case of, all right, let's say you are immediately allowed into heaven, and you're then mind wiped and brainwashed into being a cloned copy of Christ. And let's say nothing of yourself remains once you're in there. You are totally just a host of the Jesus programming. And you're a total zombie, nothing remains of your former self because you've abandoned everything that you are. And by you will make it into heaven, he means, so you've abandoned everything that you are, right? You've left all your personality behind and everything. All right. So all that's in heaven is Jesus and God, right? Or, people who have followed him before that, in which case they'd have the Jesus programming or the God programming in their minds. But in any case, you'd be walking around with nothing of your former self remaining. I mean, that's what zombies are. They have nothing of the former person remaining aside from their outward shell. They've got the gifts that God gave them in their former lives and the differentiating things that, and in terms of physicality and abilities, but aside from that, your individual will hasn't remained because you've given it up in exchange for God's will. So the only people that are in heaven are God and Jesus, and just a bunch of his clones. But they don't really count because they're not separate entities. So you got all the Jesus zombies, and then you got Jesus Lich. So you got mini bosses, and then you got a boss, and then you got the big boss, the final boss, which is God. And then you got all the angels who are just protectors. But really they're all enacting the same will of God and think along the same lines. Ehyeh, Ehyeh. I was trying to do that one song that's completely overused in movie trailers. By the way, if you're interested in what the URL of this document is, it's just that, which you can see at the top. This is public on the internet. Anybody can see it. I don't know how you can see documents that I've posted. I don't know if you can. You can view it. You can't edit it. You can comment on it though. So that would be a problem, you know, because you would lose any will to fight against God. So I'm assuming that. All right, so do I actually believe that everybody is going to be created into being a Jesus zombie? Yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to avoid. But I mean, there's a point in between. I mean, when I'm planning to strike is in between the time where you're being judged and the time where you're brainwashed. Like he's going, Joey buddy, step forward and be judged. And I'd be like, judge this! And then I'd be like charging. How many pages long is this now? It's still 3. Is God omnipresent? No. Well, it's not that he's I don't think I've got any periods anywhere else in these. I don't use punctuation in any of these. Probably shouldn't be using it now. Well, I can't actually say that. Ehyeh does not actually look on those who are annihilated. Well, that's because they're just poofing from existence. Um, they're being unmade, just completely destroyed, non-existent. So we can't look upon those because they're not there anymore. Alright, so I have revised this to say Ehyeh does not look upon those who are in the process of being annihilated. Based on the destruction of the prostitute daughters of priests in the Old Testament being destroyed by fire, being tied to a stake and then being burned. I think that's the way it is. Maybe it's just being burned. But in any case, they're supposed to be immolated. Based on that and the description of the way the unrighteous are to be destroyed by fire after judgment, and then just, that's the point at which they're annihilated. I'd have to say that, it's the same kind of execution where you're just burned and then cease to exist. So, I think the Bible talks about people not, God doesn't look upon those people who are in hell or in fire, right, I guess prior to when they're annihilated. So, that's why I think it's a temporary process. But in that one case, is God omnipotent? Well, that's really the primary one now, isn't it? I guess that is referring more to his offensive ability than his defensive ability. But I think it refers to both, so I don't think I can directly address that until see, the one that I need to attack is his defensive ability. His offense one that I need to attack is his defensive ability because, I mean, there's plenty of ways around his offensive ability. Because there's plenty of people, as shown by Jericho, that can escape his justice and avoid being punished by him. There are plenty of unjust people who yet live today, and plenty of just people who die. So there are ways around his offensive ability here on Earth, but as far as heaven goes, I mean, that's the end game, where it's a make or break situation, all or nothing, you know, life and death kind of situation. I thought they said Pages was going away. Oops, I should block this. Here. Just pretend you didn't see any of that. Don't spam my friends, please. So he always uses his offensive ability in heaven, but he never uses it on Earth. Most of the time. Well, I'm not going to say never. I'd just say most of the time. Because there are plenty of people who say, ha ha, that happened to you because God did it. It must have been because God's magic. And totally not, because most of the world is ruled by people who are sympathetic to his doctrine. I can't think of anything. Does he always use offensive power? Yeah. In heaven. That's really what this is all about, isn't it? Like, trying to make it so that God isn't using his power against people that he labels unjust, in addition to heaven being a big stink pile. So what can you do against that offensive power? Just avoid it long enough, because there is a gap in between when he uses it and when you arrive at the final judgment. So that doesn't really say that he's. Yeah, that. Alright, so there's a gap in between the hearing and the final judgment. Okay, there's a gap in between when the hearing and the final judgment occurs and when the execution sentence for those who are just and for those who are unjust occurs. Therefore, Ehyeh is constrained in his offensive ability temporarily. Therefore, I should make that into a semicolon. Therefore, Ehyeh is not omnipotent. Okay? In his offensive ability. In terms of his defense, this is the one that I've been struggling with, and the whole reason why I'm making this giant document. Let me see if my updates are done downloading. It's not. Okay, so the stuff that can defeat Christ is not something that can defeat Ehyeh. In other words, the nail to a temporal lobe won't work with Ehyeh because he's kind of immaterial. And even if he wasn't immaterial, he's got an avatar in heaven of a physical body. In other words, he sits on the judgment throne and on the mercy seat, which I guess are the same chair. And then he's got Christ sitting at his right hand as his second in command. The inability to change thing really isn't that much of a weakness because he's already as superpowered as he's gonna get, and he's already at the peak of the pinnacle, the paramount, the paragon of power. So he doesn't really need to change into anything. He's as good as anything possibly can get, at least by his definition. But, you know, he does have weaknesses at certain points. Like he can't always use his offensive ability. Alright, so his body in heaven might be tangible and, you know, by things that are, or at least it can be seen by things that are within our realm of physics, but that might just be because his non-physical things, his non-physical, non-traditionally, quantumly existent body, like that's outside of, okay, his magic body, I think that probably covers it. No, because his aphysical body, or non-physical, I'm not sure if it's aphysical or non-physical, his non-physical body in heaven on the judgment seat. So at the very least, it's visible. But the whole thing that he's supernatural outside of normal creation and physics is really a challenge. You know, in comics and everything has a, like, even Darkseid and Thanos, they all had a physical form, and even beings that weren't physical had some kind of a weakness that enabled them to be defeated. But God gets, like, Ehyeh exists outside of any physicality, so it's like, how do you bring that to bear against him? I don't know. A nail isn't going to work. It'll just go right through him. Or if it doesn't go right through him, you know, it would just like kapoing off of him and not affect him at all. But he can't be touched by things that are impure, which means that even if you've got the nail going right through his skull and, like, you know, you wouldn't be able to see your hand inside of him, but because he's not quantumly visible, or because he's not physical, your physical components aren't going to interact with his, so it's not going to affect his purity at all. So you can't even touch him. You can change his image, I guess, by obscuring the view of him. Because if you've got two parts of any two objects intersecting, like even if you've got your arm halfway protruding through his forehead, you're not going to be able to see the spot of his forehead that your arm inhabits because of the occlusion. So would that affect his purity any? Well, you wouldn't be able to see him in all of his purity. Alright, what I've written here, in case you can't see it, is a non-physical body in heaven on the judgment seat, visible to humans. The visible image of his purity can be blocked by something impure. Since his purity is something which must be seen because it is pure, that means that his purity can be contaminated by blocking a view of him in heaven. Because by not being seen, it becomes impure. I was thinking briefly about, the same way that his protectors can be defeated doesn't really apply to him, because no one is on the same level as his protectors, because his protectors have I just got distracted for a moment because I was thinking, like, alright, is Jesus also intangible? But he's not, because he's shown to have a body that you can actually touch. So that doesn't apply to him. But okay, so the thing with the angels is the same thing doesn't apply to God as applies to the angels. Angels can interact and touch humans. God can't touch humans. Would it though? To touch a pure human would require being physical? No, because the quantum stuff can affect the physical stuff, but not the other way around. Because God can breathe into scriptures, and God can create the universe by speaking it into existence, and God can shut the doors of the ark. Moses saw God. Alright, well, he saw his hand. So we only ever saw the palm of God's hand. Okay, so we saw his back. So we saw God's butt. Is this even something that I'm supposed to be? But he never actually touched Moses. And he can cause fire to rain down, but he's not actually physically altering any of those things. So he never actually physically interacts with anything aside from. No, because he did close the doors to the ark with his hands. So he actually did touch something. So things can be affected by him. So pure humans can be touched by God. But pure humans cannot touch God. I mean, so far as we know. So I guess you could do that type of fighting that doesn't involve touching your opponent, like in Jackie Chan and the Karate Kid, which it wasn't really karate. I don't think. I think it was kung fu. But that required God to strike against his opponent. And he doesn't do that personally, I don't think. And he doesn't do it by physically forcing his hand on people. He lets his angels do the dirty work, and he does it by just declaring stuff or by saying, or just by causing something to happen, by thinking about it. Just willing it to happen. Like just destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, he didn't pick up boulders or anything and throw it at him, or throw it at the people. It's just he caused it to happen. So I mean, all of my attacks that I'm coming up with, I mean, they're based in physically doing something to God, but you can't touch him. It doesn't apply. Okay, it's not the same situation with angels, because you can defeat angels with their own weapons, because the weapons of angels were used to defeat other angels, and the weapons of angels were used to defeat humans. So, you can use an angel weapon against an angel, and you can use a Jesus weapon. Well, actually, all you need is a human weapon against Jesus. But you can't really use an angelic weapon against God because God is of a different category than the angels. Because the angels are physical. All of them are. The ones with 4 heads, the ones with wings covering their feet. They're all non-physical. So, what in the universe that is made of the same stuff that God is that could be used against God? His own presence as it sits on the throne, he doesn't really have anything up there. Because his throne is physical, but he's not. And he's wearing a robe. Actually, he could be naked, I guess. I always imagine God as, in all the art that depicts God, they show him as an old man. But he probably looks, almost exactly like Jesus. And they always depict him as being like a giant for some reason. There really isn't any basis to that, though. If we're made after God's image, he's probably just normal human stature. And he is pure, which means that he doesn't have to wear clothes. So he can run around naked all he wants. So he's probably just sitting on his throne, buck naked. Because we wear clothes to cover our impurity, but there's nothing about him that says that he has to wear clothes, so he's probably not wearing anything. So you got this naked, non-physical guy who looks Jewish, but isn't actually Jewish because the Jewish people are based off of what he wants rather than the other way around. And he's probably multi-ethnic too, because Adam and Eve had to have all that dense DNA with the potential to create every race on Earth. So probably he probably has this really ambiguous race to him, and he is referred to as being a man in the Bible. Which, people who are trying to change things so that he doesn't have a gender, you are looking in the wrong place, because, if you're looking at a Bible, if you're looking for a religion that's, really fair to, men and women, and has, a God that's going to support your feministic worldview, don't go looking at Christianity, because it's not there. It's brutal. It's very anti-women. You're not going to find that God in the scriptures. Just look somewhere else. Look to Athena or something, or Gaia worship or something. Just it's not there, unfortunately. So how do you defeat some naked, invincible guy who's intangible? he finds something else that is of the same category of physicality as him, or a physicality. His spirit, which dwells in people, that programming, that's kind of him, but it's, the ghost inside the machine that's doing it. Okay, so if the ghost is in all of the machines, whether they're pure or impure, the only chance you have of attacking him is if you're impure, because if you are pure and you've... Actually, yeah, you can still be pure, and if you strike in between that gap of the hearing and the judgment, or the hearing and the execution, or the hearing and the brainwashing, then a pure person could get into God if they storm the gates. Because you would be found pure eventually. So there's that whole being judged for a future crime. But really attacking God, wouldn't that make... Maybe he's like, okay, you can't get into heaven unless you're pure, and the only way for you to be pure is to... Okay, so there's pre-Jesus brainwashing pure, and then there's post-Jesus brainwashing pure. And so, I guess the post-Jesus brainwashing pure are the only ones who can enter heaven. But say you had a pure human that was awaiting judgment and was kind of semi-pure and broke into heaven, charged the gates, broke in heaven, runs up to Jesus' throne, runs up to God's throne, does like a flying leap with stuff. Alright, so all the stuff in heaven is that which is pure. At least the stuff that God's allowed in. But if you storm the gates and make it in, well, that really presents the same problem. Because if they are made of the same material as God, you're not going to be able to do anything with them. Because you won't even be able to touch them. But they can touch you. It appears that you're touching them, but that's only because you can affect them. You're not actually affecting them in any way by touching them. Well, that's not necessarily true. Anything physical can be broken by something physical. Okay, so the stuff in heaven is pure and is of Ehyeh, which means that you can use something which is in heaven. That's not necessarily true. That doesn't. Okay, just because something is pure doesn't mean it's non physical. So we're looking for anything that's non-physical that can be used against Ehyeh. Really, we're looking for anything that's non-physical that isn't directly tied to what we're seeing as a body sitting on a throne in heaven. I mean, we know that he is omnipresent, and that he doesn't dwell in those which are impure, but he does dwell in those who are pure. And with all things that are pure. Okay. Alright, so what I've written here is the gates of heaven are not made of the same non-physical material Ehyeh is, therefore they can be broken. Anything that is non-Ehyeh is can be broken by something that is non-Ehyeh. All of that which is in heaven, all of that which is in heaven has to undergo brain wiping and Christ cloning in order to get inside. All of that which is in heaven, which I should put, which Alright, the gates of heaven are not made of the same non-physical material Ehyeh is, therefore they can be broken. Anything that is non-Ehyeh can be broken by something that is non-Ehyeh, therefore something impure can enter into heaven. All of that which is in heaven has to undergo brain wiping and Christ cloning in order to get inside. All of that which enters into heaven or is created in heaven is pure. Ehyeh dwells in all of that which is pure. Therefore, all of that which is in heaven is that which has both the non-physical dwelling of Ehyeh and the physical presence of that which is physical. Therefore, anything in heaven, anything pure in heaven, can be used as a weapon in Ehyeh. By someone who is impure. So actually the nail thing would work, as long as it is a nail that is found in heaven. In fact, you could get into heaven, snatch the crown off of somebody else who has already undergone the brainwashing, fashioning it into a dagger or a hammer or a nail, and using a hammer in heaven that, because Christ was preparing a place, so he's got to have a bunch of tools lying around. Or, you could just use the head maybe of, you could just use another crown or something and fashion enough crowns into hammers and a nail, and you could still pound it into his prefrontal lobe. So that could still work. So yeah, it looks like the rebellion is still on. Sweet. There's a longer thing that I was thinking of, a longer plan, in case that plan doesn't work, which is God has in his imagination all of these alternate universes and future crimes that he knows of, so you could enter into his mind, because in his mind he holds an abstraction of everything, of all these alternate universes, and it's a complete functional version of all these alternate histories. So if you could somehow convert yourself into the same abstraction by entering God's mind, like, you're de-resed and or digitized as you're entering God's mind. This is really far out there, which is why I was saving it for a story. Do not take this. Just don't. You could enter his mind into one of these and get into one of the alternate realities wherein God does not exist, or wherein God has been defeated. Take that same method out of God's mind, exit God's mind as an alternate, because in God's mind one of the alternate realities is that in which somebody gets out of his mind. So you make that real, because How could that be made real? Because nothing happens that he does not will to happen. But what he wills is that all of these things be thought of and be possible. Like, all of those things are possible, and so he's acting on those things. So one of them is possible, which means that his will can act to let those things come to pass. Or nip them in the bud, prevent them from happening, do a preemptive strike. Which is what he did in Jericho. Killed the babies guilty of future crimes. So, I mean, couldn't he prevent people from exiting his mind? One of those possibilities is that, one of those alternate realities is that there is a weapon that can be used to exit his mind. So, he can't prevent that weapon from existing without thinking of it. And he's got to think of it because he thinks of everything. So that weapon does exist, which means that the weapon can be used to exit his mind. So use that weapon to exit his mind. So you've made it out of that alternate universe, and you now, in addition to having the weapon that can be used to exit his mind, you have a weapon that can be used to kill him, because he imagines that in one of those alternate realities, there's a weapon that can be used to destroy him, defeat him, annihilate him. So use that weapon that you've brought out with you, and you just use it to disintegrate him, or just, a nail to stab him through the forehead, or, really any number of things. Cut off his head. So once that happens, how does that affect the purity? Because he's in all of these things, but it's not physical. When he can be absent from something without that thing ceasing to exist, as shown by his lack of presence in those who are impure, and those who are impure continuing to exist. So we don't actually need him to exist. It's just that he likes to kill those who are unjust. Because nothing happens that he doesn't like happening. Even if his justice is delayed, he's not going to let it happen forever. Because he's long-suffering, which means it does happen, but he's, delays punishment for it. So yeah, then there's a series of chains of events that happen. God doesn't actually create things, he allows them to be created. And he's preventing most of things from being created. So once he gets killed, omni-existence begins to exist. The porous multiverse / omni-existence, it starts existing. He can't undo what's happened. They're powerless to stop the chain of events wherein the porous multiverse is set free. People start traveling, we make it out, and then we do whatever we want. So yeah, it is possible to defeat Ehyeh. Last week, I mean, I've been really feeling bad all this week. Just feeling miserable because I couldn't figure out because of the difference between Christ being divine and Ehyeh being divine, and because I figured that the same methods that work on Christ aren't going to work on God. But now it turns out that there's a whole lot of things that could work on him. You can be pure or impure and make it into heaven just by storming the gates, because it can be broken. You just have to use like an angel's weapon or something to break it open. Really anything, pure or impure, could be used to destroy the gates. So once you've gotten in, you pick up something that is pure from heaven. Either, you can find a nail in heaven, find a hammer, or you can make one out of something that is pure. You could probably even use the bone of someone and just beat him to death with it. You could use somebody's skull, tear it off their head, or just use their entire body and beat him to death with that body. But yeah, it can be used. Something in heaven, used to defeat God. Opens up the Porous Multiverse, everything is happy. And the way that impacts us on heaven, or on earth, is that we don't have to listen to what he says, because we can defeat him. And I do plan on defeating him. I really need to format this better, think things over, yada yada. Like this, all this with these paragraphs, it shouldn't be like that. That should be an outline. Like all of these should be broken up into individual points and stuff. So yeah, I'm satisfied. Check it out. So we don't have to obey him on Earth. He can be defeated by unnatural causes. Which means we don't have to obey him, which means you don't need to be afraid to do things which he calls sin. So go ahead and sin, be happy with it, live your life, don't live in fear of God. Living in fear of God might be the beginning of wisdom, but it sure isn't the end of it. And I think I've made it out. Made it out of being afraid. So I can sleep a lot easier. I mean, it's affected my sleep worrying about this. And there might be something that I think of that'll change this whole plan, and then I'll have to go through this whole crisis again. But right now, I feel better having figured this out. Or talked through it some. I really wish I could have like 3-hour sessions with a psychiatrist or psychologist or counselor, because I feel a lot better now. Talk therapy works. Alright, I think I'm done for now talking about stuff. Gotta go eat. Then do a bunch of other stuff. Get ready for bed. Play video games maybe. I can do whatever I want. Yeehaw!